Today we're singling out a game that combines elements of both SimCity and Civilization.
Maybe even a little StarCraft.
Which sounds like it should work, right? This is Pixelated Audio Episode 16, Utopia, the Creation of a Nation.
Welcome back to another episode of Pixelated Audio, a bi-weekly video game music and retro gaming podcast. We're your hosts, James and Brian, and today we're going to be talking about Utopia, the Creation of a Nation.
More importantly, we're going to be playing some really awesome music from the game. The track that brought us in was from Utopia on the Atari ST, composed by Leitch. Out of all the tracks we have lined up, the Atari ST music is probably the most basic in terms of, I guess, richness due to the limitations of the sound chip, and that's the YM2149F PSG.
Yeah, I mean, the ST had some really cool music, but it always had that chiptune sound no matter what composer or what they did with the sound.
Well, the ST couldn't do samples, so it's more chiptune, like you said.
Right.
Like the C64 SID, just not as great as the C64.
Right, you can play any sound you want as long as it's square wave.
Right. Anyways, we got a special guest with us later on in the show, which is going to be awesome. But let's go ahead and dive into Utopia.
So Utopia, the Creation of a Nation, was released on the Atari ST, Amiga, and DOS in 1991, developed by Celestial Software and published by Gremlin Graphics.
A few years later, in 1993, Jaleco published the game for the Super NES, and Gremlin Graphics ended up doing the development. And the game is basically a city-building game, kind of like SimCity, only set in space, and with some really bad combat and controls thrown in just to screw with you.
We definitely didn't pick this game for the nostalgia factor, or even that it's a rare gem. The music is where it's at.
And it's excellent.
But Gremlin Graphics was kind of an interesting little software company. It started off as a computer shop called Just Micro in 1984 in the UK, and then kind of branched out into a software development company.
Right, and in 1996, they bought a Scottish dev company called DMA Designs, the creators of GTA and Lemmings, which had a lot of employees and caused them to be able to produce a lot more titles. They also now had some pretty well-known franchises under their belt, but in 1999, Gremlin was bought by Infogrames and ended up getting shut down in 2003.
It's kind of a messy history, but really interesting. It's also kind of sad to see these smaller developers meet their end by getting swallowed up by the big guys.
Yeah, it's so common with these older companies, though.
So before we get our first track going, let's talk a little bit about the composer.
The game was composed by Leitch, a Scottish composer that started off in 1986 on the Commodore 64 when he was a teenager.
An extremely talented guy that worked for over 3 decades on over 240 games across just about every platform.
I'm sure you guys will know some of his stuff.
So he started off at Magic Tech Designs, where he did a lot of Gremlin Graphics titles, countless C64 and Amiga stuff, and then moved over to Ocean Software, where he did games like Addams Family, Lethal Weapon 3, and RoboCop 3.
Yeah, he worked at Boss Game Studios, Atari Games, where he did Rush 2049 for the N64 Dreamcast and Arcade Edition, Gauntlet Legends, Spider for the PlayStation, which was awesome.
Things like Splinter Cell, Pandora Tomorrow, Velvet Assassin, but I mean, we could go on and on, so I guess we better stop.
Right. So yeah, really, really well-respected composer, tons of stuff. The track we're going to play is from the Amiga version called InGame 2.
was InGame 2 for the Amiga version of Utopia, composed by Barry Leitch.
Man, that Amiga music is just so good.
Yeah.
I really, man, that's
Such a rich sound to it.
so amped up right now after hearing that. Like, I love the like really, really heavy bass in the beginning that he starts it off with, and then you get these really like high pitched notes, but then like the bass also has this pitch bending that kind of goes along with it.
Yeah, those little like keyboard synth kind of sounds that comes in. Yeah,
Right.
I really like that.
Really dark, very, very energetic track though. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, because it starts out really dark and heavy, and then the keyboards come in, and then it's like, what? Like the complexity just like levels up, and it's all these cool notes going on, and the cool stereo back and forth, and it's just such an interesting track just right from the beginning. I mean, and that's not it. Like the track keeps evolving, and I thought it was really cool how there's spots where the level of complexity really ramps down, and it's kind of like gives your ear a break, kind of like when you're tasting wine or whatever, and you got to cleanse your palate before you taste the next part. So it's like the next treat of the song is about ready to come on. So it's really cool. I really like that.
I was thinking almost like this is kind of like in a orchestra, you have different movements, themes to the music where like the orchestra will take a break, but they'll continue play the first part and the first part of the piece or whatever, and then they'll kind of go into the secondary part. And I get a lot of that from this soundtrack because it goes into this other part where it's like really heavy, almost like tom-tom approximations, and you get these really little kind of grace melodies that just kind of come in just randomly at random spots. And I think that's so awesome how he's utilizing the sound.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to explain it. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm hungry. I was thinking of it more as like a really awesome bean dip. Like you got all the different layers to it that you get through, and it's just like keeps surprising you with more and more. And I mean, this track is just really awesome, and I just can't I just can't get over how great this music sounds and how just interesting it is without any visuals, without any gameplay.
It's like it tells a
music
story.
is just great, yeah.
It's like it tells a story. Like that arpeggio section, it just goes nuts, and it turns into this really almost crazy dance mix just midway through the song, and it does that for a while, and then it eases off and transitions into like another area of the piece. So it's really cool.
And it's just cool that it doesn't feel like a totally different song. It just feels like a new area of the song that you're exploring, and it just keeps your interest so well because you don't know what's coming next, and it might be a slower part, it might be just like an insane nuts like trippy part, and it just really keeps your attention.
Yeah, towards the end, the bass really takes over. It almost takes over the melody. You have these really high notes that are playing, but they're almost like kind of just background noise too, which the bass is trying to like convey to the listener. It's just really brilliant how these ideas are kind of take shape in the audio. So I like it.
And another interesting thing about this is a lot of games, they make music that seems like it kind of mimics what's going on in the game. Whereas for a game like Utopia, like you really would not want that because there's not a lot going on. You're waiting for things to get built, and you're deciding like I'm going to move around the map and look for different areas to play stuff. So it's kind of boring-ish. So if you had music that really felt like the gameplay, then it would be kind of boring to play. But with music like this, it's almost like you've got like a really awesome iTunes play mix while you're doing your work. And it's just like it keeps you interested because the music is really up tempo and engaging. And very engaging, whereas the gameplay is not. So, but we're getting a little long, so actually let's switch over and talk about how the game actually works.
Right. So you, the player, are a colony administrator, and the goal is to build a large, self-sufficient settlement where your citizens can not only survive, but also enjoy life. Basically, you want to turn your colony into an efficient metropolis.
And like you'd expect, the game is controlled with a cursor and a few buttons. Nothing really breakthrough. The cool thing is that the Super NES version, you could actually make use of the Mario Paint mouse as well, which is great because using the D-pad to control the cursor would be a really big nightmare.
So Utopia, unlike SimCity that has a freed mode, is just scenarios. You go through different planets with different natural environmental qualities, aliens, and so forth. The gameplay is pretty open-ended, though. You never really complete a scenario. You just expand your colony and keep the enemies at bay without any real ending.
Right, and when you start it up, it drops you with a few basic buildings on your map. No real explanation of what you're actually supposed to do.
And maybe there was like a manual, in-game manual or something like that we just didn't see.
But yeah, I mean, the good thing is that you're dropped into a practice mission which is just a sandbox mode. There's no enemies to worry about, and you're given a ton of extra resources to play around with.
Right.
But the confusing part is that it looks exactly like the first scenario in the game called Eldorian after, it's named after the aliens that live there.
Yeah, I didn't realize for the first 15 minutes that I wasn't even in a scenario.
No, neither did I.
You actually have to go in and start a new game and then select a level. Pretty confusing for a first-time player, but, other than that, it plays the same.
Yeah, it's basically the same thing.
Well, let's get into some music. Next up is InGame 4 from Utopia on the Super NES, composed by Barry Leitch. You just heard InGame Music 4 from Utopia on the Super NES, composed by Barry Leitch.
What an odd track compared to the last one we just played. This one is
right.
To me, it felt like the bass played a smaller role in the beginning, and this one was more
right.
Like to me, it had a little bit of a happier feel to the beginning of this track.
The whole song kind of did, really. Yeah, I want to say, yeah, it's very different than the Amiga version that we played, and even the Atari ST track that we played, to start off the show. Mm-hmm. I think this is still a really cool track, and it's just like, it does take a lot from the other ones in the sense that it has these different movements in, throughout the track. And I think that's what makes it kind of identifies it as still a Utopia soundtrack game.
Right.
But the thing about this title or this track is that it only shows up in the Super NES version. The other versions only have the 4 tracks, and this is like the extra track. So it was almost like an afterthought, but it's really cool addition.
Yeah, that was something that we noticed right away once we started looking at all 3 of these soundtracks, is that this one had a whole extra one, which is cool. And it has, like you said, that same progression feel. It changes and evolves, and which is really cool. And one of my favorite parts is there's like, halfway through the song or so, there's a part where you think the song's over. It's kind of gets real silent. There's a little bit of like background noise, and then it just picks up in a whole new direction.
Yeah, that xylophone playing part. It's like this love song power ballad meets, I don't know. It's just this really, really cool. It just transforms totally.
Right, and at that point, I feel like that's when the bass takes back over, much like the last song that we played, and the keyboards and the xylophone stuff kind of takes more of a background seat for a little bit, and then once again it continues to evolve, and it just, I think the piece too has such a great arc back to the beginning.
Right,
it just makes a full loop of progression, and then it sounds good. It's like this one great movement,
gradual kind of, and then return to base kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's really awesome. That last section that's in this track, it kind of gave me this kind of, so when that power ballad part ends, it trails on that low bass note, and then all of a sudden, like, it picks up with this crazy, like, Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor kind of, just crazy kind of like house dark, just really unique, and didn't feel like it would be the place to put this in a track, but like it works so well before coming back to that original sound again. So I liked it. I like this track, and I think it was really interesting that it's only in the Super Nintendo version.
Yeah, there's just so many cool parts of these songs with what seems like very little to go on from the game, from the game aspect, that there's, not a lot of story and there's not a lot of stuff going on the screen. So it's just kind of really interesting to see how there's just so much creativity in the music. And I really, really like that.
Yeah, I think that one of the things about the soundtrack is that it doesn't have any really specific feel to what you need to do in the game. It's more of like, it is background music, but at the same time, there's these different stories in the track kind of make you feel like you're doing different parts of this game, like you're building new areas, or it's kind of leads you to kind of feel that you're doing something new, even though the game is pretty bland and basic.
Right.
But anyways, let's get back to the game for a minute.
Since the player's job is to colonize the new planet, you need to build everything from scratch. So like Age of Empires or games like that, you need more than just money and resources. You actually need a lot of time for whatever you need to build to be usable.
Yeah, and certain buildings like hospitals or factories need people to work there, so managing the population is important. I didn't get far enough to really worry about like taxation or birth rate or anything like that, but that also plays into how you grow your colony.
Which is cool.
Yeah, and I played a lot of Civilization 1 and 2 as a kid. Like, those were my games like this, like SimCity. Like, I played SimCity, but it was more of Civilization that I was really, really into, and I would love to do an episode on that, but except the version I had no music, so it's not really going to happen. But there's a lot of qualities it shares. So Civilization also was that you had to worry about, your population and taxation and luxury and like, certain ways to kind of improve your economy. And this game takes a lot of elements from that, because Civilization came out, I believe, that in general, when you're doing like a city sim or something like like this kind of game, you kind of need to have all these elements to play in, even the military aspects.
Yeah, there's certain aspects of a game like this that you kind of need to replicate.
Yeah, so I wouldn't trade Civ for this game any day, but it does have some interesting things to go off of. And I know there are people, I looked on like some forums and stuff, and there are people that really dug this game. So, we don't have nostalgia for it, so that could be why we're a little bit, but it did some things right.
For me in general, I've never really been big into games like this anyways, that play like a simulation type stuff. So
right. And I think the hardest thing about this game for me diving in was that, you don't get a lot of info. There isn't really a lot of stuff to go off of.
Right. And really the only stuff you do get is from your board of advisors.
Right. There's like 6 or 7 advisors that you can consult to kind of find out, what you need to do in the game.
And they really aren't all that helpful. They just say things like, you need more colonists, you probably should raise taxes or something. Very basic help. But I mean, then again, I didn't play for real long and I didn't really listen to them. So that's probably why I didn't really know what I was supposed to do. So.
Right. I'm in the same boat.
So anyways, let's get into some of the graphics.
Yeah. So they're pretty ugly.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that.
It's the game takes place in this like isometric landscape. Very different from, Sim City, where it's just a straight frontal view.
Right.
But it is kind of like Civ, because Civ took on that isometric perspective, especially in Civ 2, I believe. So the buildings are, you kind of have to think about how you're moving stuff around. Now, where SimCity uses like streets and stuff that you need to be able to, make railroads and stuff.
Right.
This game doesn't require any of that.
Yeah, there's no need to move between buildings or make a city layout that makes sense.
I guess why I think it's not that they're horrible. I mean, they are, but like the other thing is just the visual kind of aspect, because the buildings are very, very smashed. They're like touching each other. I mean, they're touching each other, and the viewable grid is really, really small. You only have, so when you're looking at the screen, it's almost like claustrophobic to me, because you can only see a very small grid. So maybe like a 20 by 20 square in front of you. And
when your world is much, much bigger.
When the map is huge, maybe 100 by 100 squares or something like that for the playable area. And the only way to navigate around, you can't move with the cursor. You actually have to move with this little on-screen D-pad. You have to click the arrows to actually scroll, almost like a conveyor belt. Like your viewable area is like on a conveyor belt, or like you said, a treadmill. Yeah,
that kind of goes in all directions. You're kind of constantly moving to one side to make more of your viewable area, but you also are losing what you were looking at before. So you can get lost very quickly on your planet, like that I'm actually a lot further from my main city than I wanted, or that I'm actually really close. So you can get lost pretty easily.
Yeah, the saving grace for how horrible the map design was is that there was a button you could actually go into the menu that you could see the full map and where you were on like a little viewable area, like in a little square, and you can kind of move that around and click on different areas. But at the same time, it just was really cumbersome to have to do that, to be able to look very far onto like the left-hand side of your screen or left-hand side of your map and then quickly go to the right. You had to like go through this weird sub-menu to get there. And it didn't help that the cursor, the frame rate was like just horrible. So navigating around, even with the cursor, was not that great. I didn't play the Super NES version,
which is the one that I played.
Right. So how would you compare I mean, I guess you can't compare, but maybe we can kind of explain our situations, because I played the DOS and Amiga, and I don't know, for me, it was very, very difficult to just navigate, even with a mouse. I couldn't even imagine doing it with a D-pad.
Right, and it just wasn't very precise. It was very easy to accidentally move 2 or 3 spaces and then try to go one back, but end up moving 2. And it just was very difficult to kind of remember what you were actually doing or where you want to place things. So to me, the layout was a little different. You were saying for the other versions that there was a menu along the right side. For me, the menu was along the bottom corner, so it was kind of like a V shape around the corner. So you had your different buttons to click on, and then you could go into your menu to see the list of buildings, or you could go talk to your advisors and stuff like that. So it was minor layout differences, but the visuals of the games were very similar. I did notice that the board of advisors look completely different between the different games.
Oh yeah, so let's talk about them a little bit. They're basically, so when you go to consult your council, they just appear on the screen, and it's like they're sitting at like desks. And it's funny because they all kind of look like they're like these cookie cutter kind of
Very
cardboard
generic
layout
characters,
people
yeah.
just sitting there, and they don't have any animation. They're just sitting there, like very, very basic.
It's funny in the Super Nintendo version, the advisor that's in the bottom left corner, he kind of is like tilted to the side. It almost looks like he's falling asleep, kind of.
He might be.
Yeah,
He might be.
and he's like an
"God,
old
this
wizard
game."
looking guy. And then there's like aliens.
There's one that looks like Zoidberg.
Yeah, there's not. He doesn't look like that in the Super Nintendo one.
Okay, so
I think he's like green and it's got like spiky things on his head. So they look very different, but they all are the same type of characters. Like there's the military guy that's in the bottom right and stuff like that. So they all have their different things that they're interested in as far as the protection or research or colonists and stuff like that. So it's very similar. They just gave it a different look.
right. But the character, it reminds me of really early DOS or EGA kind of graphics, maybe more colors, but it's still very funny how that they have no movement. They're just sitting there and you have to click on them to get like some text on the screen. It's almost like there's no reason for them to be there at that point.
Yeah, it could have just been a list. And for a game that doesn't have a lot of actual animation or moving parts, you would think they could have embellished a little bit for that section and make them a little bit more creative. But I mean, it's not something that you have to go to a lot. It seems like they give you a general thing and you keep in mind, I need more people to build this, or now I don't have enough housing for the number of people that I have. So it kind of snowballs the type of things you need to do. So I would assume once you get going and once you get the hang of the game, you're not really needing to check in with them very much.
Yeah, we probably should have paid more attention to those guys.
Yeah.
The buildings themselves are kind of interesting too. They're just pixel artwork, just different sprites, and there's not a lot of movement and stuff, but they do look kind of cool. Like, looking at like the university or the, power plant, or I don't know, different kind of electricity generators and stuff like that. They're kind of cool.
Right. And where the isometric is difficult to control with it, on a D-pad for a lot of games, it usually looked very three-dimensional, which was interesting. So I could see why they could go for something like that, where these buildings don't look flat. The world kind of has
they have a little more depth to them. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can have a little bit of overlap and stuff. And the buildings were quite different, which was kind of neat. So all the different buildings looked very different from one another.
Right.
In the Super Nintendo version, there was so many buildings, though. I mean, there was
Right.
like tons and tons of buildings to pick from.
I think it's the same in the Amiga and DOS. Like
okay.
I couldn't believe how many. I was like, oh my God, I can't even afford any of this stuff. Like,
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm ever going to get to this
Yeah,
place.
there was like sports stadiums
Right.
and big research facilities and stuff like that, which is really cool. So there's a huge variety of things to pick from.
It's funny you said that the buildings have a lot of variety, but that's totally contrast to the worlds, the environments.
Right.
They're very, very bland. There's almost no. I mean, yeah, we mentioned that there's some environmental differences, but that's kind of like how populations or alien races affect it more. They basically just look like dirt grounds. Like,
Right,
there is
like-
nothing to them.
Like as if you just went to the moon or Mars or something and decided to start popping buildings down. There's
nothing there.
Yeah, there's not like mountains or like valleys and stuff like that.
It's
which
pretty
is
flat.
Yeah, which I could see for a game like that would be very difficult to program all that stuff in. But
Right.
I mean, it had cool environmental things like solar eclipse, where if you didn't have enough power generators, your solar panels wouldn't be collecting any energy, so your city might run out of power.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
stuff.
I didn't
so
even-
there was
I didn't even know
interesting
that.
things like that.
Well, hey, we got a guest lined up in just a second, but we're going to play one more track. This is from the Amiga version of Utopia. It's InGame 3. that track was InGame 3 for Utopia on the Amiga, and joining us here for a quick chat is the composer. We've been talking about your music and past work a bit, and maybe you could, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about more of what you do.
Sure. Hi, I'm Barry Leitch. I write music for video games and kids' toys. I've written the music for over 200 video games and a lot of stuff.
I guess I should start off with a kind of de facto question here, but we're actually really interested in what kind of influenced your work, any specific composers or artists that might have made a big impact on you?
Well, when I started composing, it was on the Commodore 64, so it was the technical challenges with that is what limited you. You only had 3 channels and 4 or 5 different synth sounds. It's sine wave, square wave, the pulse width modulation stuff.
Not a whole lot to work with.
No, and when you're building from that, it limits. I mean, you're just being able to use an arpeggio to simulate playing a chord was a huge breakthrough.
Right. Any other musical influences?
Influences? I was influenced by the other composers at the time, what they were doing on the Commodore 64.
Right.
And as things had progressed, my own musical tastes influenced a lot of stuff. There's probably several tunes that are reminiscent of Sisters of Mercy tunes, things like that. And then I got to do the album with Alien Sex Fiend for the Inferno soundtrack.
Right. So usually on our podcast, we spend a minute talking about the track we just played. How would you describe that last piece, InGame Music 3? And maybe what was your inspiration while you worked on the music for this game?
Well, InGame, the whole Utopia project was kind of cool because InGame 3 was... it was mainly influenced by the demo scene. When I was talking before about doing stuff on the Commodore 64, that was all. I started creating demos, trying to find work, and as the computers evolved, the demo scene evolved, and I'd pay a lot of attention to what people were doing with that. InGame 3 was the big one because I'd heard somebody had done a demo tune that had 2 bass sounds. It had the slap bass as well as the sustained fat bass sound. So I was like, I should do that. I should do some of that stuff. And I'd noticed people were using several samples of different tones to create effects. And I was like, I should put all those things together and it would sound really good.
That's awesome. No, we were actually just talking about that when we were listening to it. We were saying there's like a lot of slap bass in there, and there's like these kind of pops and clicks every now and then, like that are obviously intended. And it's just really cool because we wanted to focus on the soundtrack specifically because I grew when I was growing up, like, my friends and stuff were really into the demo scene and the music, and that got me really into it. So we had when we heard this, it kind of caught us off guard. We didn't grow up with this game, so I don't have like a nostalgia factor to it. We heard it much later on in life. So when I was listening and, James was, listening, we were just kind of like, oh my God, like this is.
When we first heard the Utopia on that Super Nintendo, it immediately caught our attention as like, this is really cool music, a lot of really cool stuff going on, and that it was music that had a lot of like time and like thought process put into it, that it was a really cool soundtrack.
And it paid a lot of homage to that demo scene stuff. So yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, and those demo scene tunes, I mean, they had the whole 512 kilobytes to do their tunes in on the Amiga. It was they got to do all these amazing things using big samples and stuff. And when it came to doing games, you only ever had like 60 or 80 kilobytes. Mm-hmm. So these tunes were tiny.
Yeah, and actually to bring that up, because the Amiga version is actually like my favorite, but the Super NES version actually had an extra track. Can you maybe explain why that is? Because I noticed all the other versions only have 4 tracks, but the Super Nintendo one has the 5th.
Yeah, you know what? I'd completely forgotten that the SNES one had had an extra tune. It was only when I found it on YouTube a couple of years ago, I'm like, oh my God, I'd totally forgotten I wrote that. It wasn't a very good track. I think it was just one of those ones where like, hey, we need an extra tune for the Nintendo one. You want to come down and do one? So I would have gone to Sheffield and knocked it out in a day. So
that's awesome. So you've done, a huge array of platforms. What would you say your finest accomplishment is in game audio? And also, which format, like audio format, did you enjoy working on the most?
I'll start in reverse. The one that I enjoyed the most, the format, was the Roland MT32.
Right.
Just because we had such a really good driver for it, we could create all the synth sounds we wanted very easily. So I think one of the soundtracks I was most proud of was the TFX soundtrack.
Mm-hmm.
Just because almost every sound in it was created from scratch.
That's awesome.
And I think it really pushed the hardware to its limits. I mean, after that, you got the CD stuff, so it was an even playing field. But I always felt that our MT32 stuff was kind of head and shoulders above everybody else.
Nice. I guess I should counter that with, what system was kind of the biggest nightmare to work on?
Probably some of the AY chips, like the Atari ST and Sinclair Spectrum Plus 3, Amstrad. Although we had a single music driver that enabled us to. All I would have to do was to do a conversion for one of them, and it would play on all the different machines. So that made life a lot easier. But it was still a pain in the butt because there was only so much you could do to make it sound good.
It's funny because we actually started the show off with an Atari ST track. We were talking earlier too. Like it is the most. Out of all the other versions, it does have the most basic kind of sound to it. So
square wave or white noise, that's all you got.
That's pretty much it. So, you have a really heavy resume working at companies like Ocean, Origin, Boss Atari Games. We were wondering if you could kind of describe the process about how game audio is done, maybe from, like a project perspective. So when does a company approach the composers, and at what point in the game's life cycle does audio start to kind of fit into the mix?
Well, usually in those days, it was they would plan from the start, and at some, halfway through the development, they'd start wanting to put some audio in. These days, when I'm freelancing, it's usually 20 minutes before the game's due to be released. And they're like, hey, we need a whole soundtrack for this. Really? You guys couldn't have thought about this earlier? It's like, we were going to use a brother's friend, but he disappeared.
Awesome. Did they usually give you like a few months to work with, or was it like really like days?
Yeah, it varies from project to project. There was so many that I did that were just, we have an hour. There was one on the PC. I think it was it was a cover of Your Own Tell tune.
Okay.
Imperium or something, and it was like. Honestly, it was like 4 p.m. on a Friday, and they're like, hey, if you can knock out a tune in the next hour, the game will ship with music, but if not, it's not going to have any.
Oh, man, that's a record.
Now, when they would ask you to do tracks, did they give you like clips of the game or kind of like a synopsis of the story, or did they just...
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, on a game like Spider, the Boss Games Studio one.
I just mentioned that game because that was a game that I loved growing up, and a lot of people don't even remember that game, but I loved Spider. Sorry, go ahead and continue.
Yeah, it was hardly marketed at all. There was no sales push behind it, so it didn't sell very much, but I had a better part of 6 or 8 months to develop the score, so I think it was a lot more mature than a lot of the other stuff I wrote. There was a lot of time to use inspiration rather than approach it as a mathematical composition type deal.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. We're going to take a quick break here to play a track from the PC version of Utopia called InGame 1 using the Roland MT32. So let's get that started and we'll be right back.
Sure.
that was the Roland version of InGame 1, music from Utopia on the PC.
So, Barry, that was a track that I just got from you. We were emailing each other back and forth a few days ago, and I had mentioned that I love the Amiga music for Utopia, and you were like, have you heard the better PC Roland MT32 version? So you sent it over. Way different than any of the other versions, but I'm curious why you said it's the better version. Could you kind of explain that a bit?
I liked it because we got to create more sounds for it. I wasn't so dependent on samples for everything.
Yeah, so like when you were composing these tracks, was that like your base version or you were going for, or did it kind of evolve?
Everything was usually composed on the Amiga because it was so quick. We had a tracker as a sequencer and had a huge library of samples. So everything was composed on that and then converted to different formats.
So could you maybe talk a little bit about this track, InGame 1? Yeah,
InGame 1 was... it was inspired by Populous. I mean, Utopia was basically a Populous ripoff anyway, so it was
right.
I had done the conversion of the Populous music to the PC version. I think Populous 2 maybe. I can't remember. I need to look at my resume to see. But so it was inspired by using the choirs, and I wanted to try and do something dancey with it, and just a kind of slow, mellow beat and stuff. And I was having fun with it, using the synth sounds because it gets kind of trippy towards the end.
Oh yeah, we noticed that.
Yeah, there's it's a really mellow track compared to some of the other ones. And then right at the end, actually, that's what we kind of wanted to ask you about too. It's like a lot of these tracks in your music for this game specifically tend to go through like their own phases. Like they have like a different thought.
They transition into like a different mood, almost like there's almost like a storytelling aspect to the track itself. Like this one starts out really mellow and then kind of builds into like it feels like a darker place. And then there's that really high energy trippiness towards the end.
Well, you never know what's going to be going on in the game at the time, or, at the time, interactive music wasn't really gaining a foothold. And so it was, you would try and write different themes into the pieces, like the InGame 2 piece as well. I put a death march in there because I was sitting reading a magazine that had a review of the game, and they were talking about how the music was all interactive and had a death march. So well, I thought, well, maybe I should put one in the game.
Yeah, I like it.
There was a little bit of cheating on the magazine's front, but it worked out all right in the end.
Yeah. So we've listened to a lot of your stuff on SoundCloud, but aside from that, are there any other projects that you've been working on or like want to actually do lately?
I'd love to do a nice big video game score again. I haven't done one of those for a while. Usually most of the video games I've worked on these days have been little things for Facebook or Android stuff. Mm-hmm. I've been working on Dark Quest 2. I'm having fun with that.
Awesome.
The piece on SoundCloud called Beauty and the Beast, that's for Dark Quest 2.
I actually really like that track. That one stood out to me.
That was rad. There's a lot of new like indie games and stuff coming out. Really amazing stuff on like Kickstarter where you might have a lot more freedom to do what you want. Could you see yourself returning to like game composition for this type of market? Or, would you prefer like a more recognizable company?
Anybody that's willing to pay, I'll write music for them. It's, I mean, that Father John's piece that's on there, I was inspired by... It's a local bar restaurant thing.
That's what you're saying, yeah.
It's an old church. This guy bought it. He turned the basement into a bar, and they have live shows upstairs, comedy shows and bands and stuff. And I was just he's got all these world religion themes around there, a lot of Tibetan stuff and Indian gods. He's got little statues of everything in there, which is all, there's a lot of imagery and themes that work with that. I was very inspired with it, and you got to imagine I spend a lot of my time writing happy toy music for children.
Well, for the last 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So,
and to get just inspired by that, I was thought, I'm going to write a really dark piece.
That was a very dark track. It was very kind of disturbing. Kind of put me in a sad spot there.
Sad spot, really?
No, it was an awesome track. I liked it a lot.
I was using all those world instruments and stuff. I was having fun with it. It was just something to play with, to keep my claws sharp, compositional wise. I'm
actually pretty curious. A lot of people would assume that game composers are really big gamers themselves. So I was always curious to find out if you were actually a gamer growing up or if you play games now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you got to figure we used to play every video game that was released. I mean, these days there's so many, you can't keep up with it. But I mean, I still play games a lot. I'm a big RTS player. Supreme Commander 2 was my game of choice, and was the Universal Global Destroyer. It's my official title. Nice. Number one on the planet.
Nice. Any like recent composers or anything that you hear their music in games that you're playing now or something, and you're like, wow, this is a really awesome track? Or do you really find yourself being aware of other composers' stuff while you're playing games? Or
there's only been one series of games that I really got hooked by the compositions, and that was Stronghold Crusader.
Well, that's one that I missed. Is
Stronghold series. He just did all these great medieval tunes that had they all had good melodies, and I'm a big fan of melody because of the whole. Starting on the Commodore 64, that was the only thing you had was a melody. I mean, these days it's so easy just to create atmospheric pieces that really don't have any melody or
the Hans Zimmer in like every new game coming out.
Yeah. No, I had read in one of your interviews that you had said that modern composers could do more with melodies, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there hasn't been an awful lot that really catches me, and even then, is the music's so busy. It's almost. When you go back and listen to chip music from the demo scene now, and it just stands out so much because it's so strong.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we started doing this podcast, because a lot of chip music or video game music, especially early stuff, was really there's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of really strong melody that's attached to these, and people remember them for that.
Yeah, because you could pop on a track for someone that maybe isn't even a big gamer, and they'll be like, oh, I remember playing that game as a kid. And whereas modern game music, a lot of it just sounds like movies, and like you could play a track for someone from a huge game, and they played that game, and they would never even know that it was from the game they actually played. So,
right.
So we thought there was something there that was like that we wanted to tap into and learn more about.
Do you listen to composers from like more Western composers, or do you listen to any Japanese composers, like video game composers as well?
Mostly Western. I was never a big fan of Japanese game music. I hate to say.
Hey, to each his own, right? What would you say is like your most influential, or maybe just your favorite composer, like for game audio?
It has to be Rob Hubbard. I mean, the guy.
Good choice.
Musical genius, and technically second to none.
Very cool. Good choice.
We don't want to take up too much more of your time, but we really wanted to say that we appreciated chatting with you today about your work.
Well, thanks. It's great to chat with you guys.
Very cool having you on. So to kind of quickly recap the show, we covered Utopia, the creation of a nation across the PC, Amiga, Atari ST, and the Super NES, composed by Mr. Barry Leitch. Anything else, James?
No, so I just want to say thanks everyone for listening. You can visit us online at pixelatedaudio.com. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at pixelatedaudio, and you can subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher, and don't forget to leave us some comments.
Yeah, Barry, if they want to find some of your music, where would they be able to track you down?
SoundCloud's probably the best place. I haven't updated my website in years. Or follow me on Facebook, find me on there.
Very, very cool. So, at the end of the show, we always kind of leave with a remix track from a game that we've covered. Today, we're very lucky since we have a remix done by Barry himself. Could you kind of tell us a little bit about that before we close out?
Sure. I'd been looking through my old Amiga tunes, looking for something to remix and give some new life to. I've done a lot of tracks for the Immortal series of game remix CDs. So I found that tune. I felt there was a lot of room to develop it, and improve the sounds on it, especially with the trippy bit towards the end. So I wanted to do something with that.
Yeah, it's a pretty insane. There's a lot going on in this remix. I totally dig it.
Yeah, and I have to give thanks to Tim Haywood for doing the final mix of it, because it'd been sitting on my hard drive for a year and I hadn't finished it. So Tim wanted to do the final mix. And
very, very cool.
He did that.
I just want to say thanks again to our guest, Barry Leitch, and to everyone that's been listening to this episode, and we'll see you again in the next one.
Thanks for listening.